Okay, so the FCC. As I mentioned, the FCC was born in the days of radio. It was supposed to regulate the spectrum for radio traffic so they didn't overlap. And originally, the idea of the FCC came out of the Hays Code. The Hays Code was something that goes back to the film industry of the 1920s. They had to kind of self police and clean themselves up. There were a lot of little rules that the Hays Code put in place, excuse me, like two people couldn't sleep in the same bed. You had to show police in a positive light. Um, you couldn't, in television at least, you're not supposed to show people drinking alcohol out of a bottle. Um, Bras, you up until the late 80s, like 89, 90, you could not show a woman in a bra on television. Um, it they changed the rules. They decided, swimwear has gotten risque, bras are nothing, and they allowed them to start showing women in bras in the 1990s, and there was an explosion on cable networks of scantily clad women then. But prior to 1990s, you couldn't show a woman walking around in a bra. There's a famous story about Barbara Eden's midriff. Barbara Eden, I Dream of Jeannie, she had great abs. She wanted to show off her abs. And the network said, no, you can't show your navel. So if you saw Barbara Eden on television, she had her I Dream of Jeannie outfit came up above her belly button. And Barbara Eden fought him and said, this is stupid. Who cares about a belly button? And after 2 or 3 seasons, they relented and they said, yes, you're right. You can go ahead and show your belly button. And then Barbara Eden's pant line fell down. She was showing off her tummy. And Barbara Eden had great abs, and she had every reason to show them off. So the FCC regulated something called the Fairness Doctrine. The Fairness Doctrine was an idea that you couldn't, they didn't want the possibility that someone could dominate the message and not allow equal time for the opposite opinion, particularly in politics. If you're going to have a Republican on, you had to have a Democrat on. And they wanted time for both sides of an issue to be presented and discussed. This was the origination of the point counterpoint type programming, especially those like Sunday shows where they're just yelling at each other. Well, the concept was we've got people on each sides representing themselves. They're allowed to talk. And they had to provide them each equal time to make their points. There was a rule about educational content. The FCC said they recognized that children were going to spend a lot of time staring at this thing. So they made it mandatory that they do some kind of educational programming. I don't know the current rules, but I believe they are required to produce 3 hours per week of educational programming, not produce, air 3 hours of educational programming a week. Every station is required to do 3 hours of educational programming each week. Educational programming is marked with the letters EI in the corner. You'll see it like this. It'll say E/I in the corner of the broadcast signal, and that designates that as an educational programming. They also got by doing this Schoolhouse Rock thing back in the 70s, and these were little 1-minute PSAs, and they would pepper those in with kids programming, especially the Saturday morning cartoon shows to kind of educate people. They'd use that little Schoolhouse Rock cartoon thing to educate kids on how a bill becomes a law and stuff like that. Our local Fox affiliate actually managed to get the TV show Saved by the Bell to be considered educational content. I have no idea what the educational content of Saved by the Bell was, but when Saved by the Bell aired on the local Fox affiliate here in Seattle, it had an EI on it, and it counted towards its 3 hours of educational programming each week. And they do go through and count this, and you can go to your local television station and say, I want to see your books, and they'll present their books, and they will show you, this is what we did for educational content this week. This is what we did for equal time for politicians. This is what we did for, they have all these different categories they have to meet, and they just spell it out in the book. And you can go down to your local television station and say, I want to see the book. And they're supposed to have it at the front desk, and they can pull it out and you can look at it to prove that they're staying compliant with the FCC. Children's programming rules. There's some very specific rules on what can be considered a children's programming. There, some of the rules. Um, there's only X amount of commercial time that's allowed in a children's programming. I mean, as far as they're going to take a commercial break. You can only put so many minutes of commercials in an hour. And it's up to the individual TV station to count the programming to see that they're not exceeding their maximum allowable commercials. They have to make sure that they stay compliant with whatever the FCC tells them is acceptable. And that includes advertisements in the program. There's not supposed to be any advertisements in the program, but if a character in the program is walking around with a Pepsi can, that counts as advertisement. So that counts against the amount of commercial content they're allowed to air on the show. Other children's programming rules. If you're doing a children's program, you must have a bumper when you leave the program that says, "We'll be right back," as well as another bumper after the commercial break, and it says, "Now back to the program." There was another rule that said when the websites became a pervasive part of the programming, you have the commercial, and the commercial says, "Go to our website." If it's a kids program, if it's a program that is designated for children to watch, then the rule the FCC put down is you're not supposed to be able to get to an ad within 3 clicks of the website. So whatever URL they have on the screen, if the Joe average guy goes there and clicks 3 clicks from that website, click, 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 you're not supposed to see an ad within 3 clicks. If you do see an ad within 3 clicks, you cannot run that commercial. You cannot run that commercial in the program. This is tricky because the individual stations are responsible for monitoring this and making sure they stay compliant. So that means every station has to look at this and say, okay, there's a commercial that's going in a kids programming. There's the URL. I have to go to the URL and I have to check and make sure that anything I can click on within 3 clicks of this main homepage does not take me to an ad. If it does, they got to pull the ad. The FCC regulated something called Family Hour, and that was between 5 and 9 p.m. Family Hour, the opinion of the FCC was people were coming home from work around 5 o'clock, and children don't go to bed before 9. So their opinion was between the hours of 5 and 9 p.m., you had to have programming content that was suitable for all ages. There was another rule to that. Local affiliate versus national content. The affiliate must originate 2 hours of content between 5 and 11 p.m. So that means they don't have to produce 2 hours of content, but they have to commission 2 hours of content. And the idea here is the FCC felt it was important that the individual stations represent the interest of their affiliates. So you couldn't, if you put on just the national network all night long, then you never got a local view. Your local demands were not being met. So that's why between 5 and 11 p.m., there must be at least 2 hours of locally produced content. This led to the shows like Evening Magazine and game shows. One of my favorite examples of this is actually The Muppet Show. And the reason this is one of my favorites is Jim Henson had proposed doing a Muppets television program for years and couldn't get any of the national networks to sign on. Finally, this guy at ITV in England said, "I like the idea, let's do it over here." So Jim Henson actually went to England to film The Muppet Show. But the brilliance of it was when he got done, he turned around and sold it to all the local affiliates who now had a programming hole. They had to fill this 2-hour block. And The Muppet Show was not on the network. It was an affiliate program. So the affiliates could buy it and air it before they went to network. So it was kind of a pre-draw before the network came on the air. So usually the Muppet Show was on 6:30 to 7, and then at 7 o'clock the network would take over. It was a great lead in to the network, so the networks were really fond of it. Let's see, local versus original, 90 minutes, locally produced content each week. Okay, FCC rules. Every station must produce 90 minutes of locally produced content each week. Now, what this means is they have to originate and produce in their studios 90 minutes uh, that's directly involved in the community. For most of our local affiliates here in Seattle, that is local news. Also, the evening magazine programs count. The original concept of the evening magazine program was they would get about 5 stations together. Each one would contribute a 5 to 6 minute package, and they would package these together, and that would count. Each station that aired it, that would count 5 minutes towards their content goals. Unfortunately, that kind of evaporated and went away, but evening magazine still exists here in Seattle. In the case of KSTW, KSTW is a TV station here in Seattle that does not have a news program. It's um, an independent channel, and they have to still meet this 90-minute locally produced thing, but they don't have a news program. What they do is they get a panel together every week, and they put them in a room, something like this, and they bring up a local topic, and they have the group discuss it, just get their opinions on the subject. And then when their opinions are expressed, they air it on television, usually like 3 a.m. in the morning on Saturdays. But they get their 90 minutes in that way. Um, Fairness doctrine, point counterpoint, I mentioned that already. That's where those originated from. Uh, Now, regarding the news, the FCC has a rule that says the opinions of the station or the opinions of an anchor or whatever cannot be expressed unless they've got a disclaimer before it. So you'll see a local anchor say, "This is just my opinion," but boom, okay, that's okay. But if it's not a fact, if he's just stating an opinion, he has to clarify, "This is my opinion on this matter." Same with editorializing. If we're going to editorialize a subject, we have to call it an editorial segment. Um, the one exception to that is sports. The FCC did make an exception for sports because the whole point of sports is to hype up your local team. So sports broadcasters are giving some latitude on stating the facts. They can embellish if they want because it's PR for the local team, so they're allowed to expand on their opinion. Now, the fairness doctrine in the 1980s, the National Association of Broadcasters approached Reagan and said, "This is an antiquated piece of work. We don't need this anymore." And their reasoning behind it is they said, "There's so many cable networks out there that there's no shortage of opinions. This is a redundant piece of work." And so Ronald Reagan repealed the Fairness Doctrine in 1988, I think it was 88, 87, 86. So Ronald Reagan repealed the Fairness Doctrine. The result of that was it opened the floodgates for punditry. So now when you go to Fox News, they claim to be fair and balanced, but if you notice, it's all just people with an opinion spouting off whatever they believe. And that was because of Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan opened the door for punditry on television. Now, when it came to cable, cable television arrived in the 1980s, and when it came to cable, the FCC said you can have cable television in your city. However, the cable network must carry the local affiliates on the broadcast spectrum, on their cable spectrum. They couldn't put it up as competition to the local television stations. They had to include local television stations on the cable broadcast. So that's why when you get cable, you get all your local affiliate stations. They also said the cable companies must provide public access programming. That being that anybody who has an opinion should have a channel they can go to and make their own television shows. Now, prior to cable, television stations were on the air until about midnight, and then they went off the air and they put color bars or the Indian head on the screen, and that concluded their broadcast day. We now conclude our broadcast day. Um, well, the cable companies kind of poo-pooed this. They said, no, cable broadcast 24/7. If we're going to carry the local affiliates, they must carry content 24/7. Well, the local affiliates didn't have content 24/7. However, it turned out there were these people who were willing to pay them to put on content 24/7, and those were infomercials. That's where infomercials came from. It filled a void that the local affiliates had of they didn't have broadcast content for those 8 hours of the night when they were turned off, and now they had these people who wanted to buy 30-minute blocks of time to promote their program. Fine. So that's why infomercials popped up in the 1980s. Local affiliates needed to fill that AM hours programming. The emergency alert system, back in the 70s, it was the emergency broadcast system. Today it's called the emergency alert system. It was supposed to be a standard where if there was an emergency, they could get a message out to the broadcast public and say, a tornado is coming, take cover, or something like that. There was a comedian I heard who was watching 9/11, and he said every cable station jumped on it except for they never once turned the EAS on. When are you going to break this thing out? Now, the EAS system must be tested monthly. The local affiliate has to do a test once a month, and that's usually just run of schedule. They just schedule it when it's convenient for them. Once a month, they schedule in some time to run an EAS. Once a quarter, they have to do it randomly, and that's originated by the FCC. The FCC sends them a little ticker taker that says you must do an EAS now. And when they get that little test ticker taker, they have a 1-hour window to run that test. The only exception I've ever heard of that was I was working for one of the local TV stations. We were running the World Series, and we got an EAS test. And one of my bosses got on the phone, called the FCC, and he said, we're in the middle of the World Series. I am not running an EAS test during the World Series. And they gave us a waiver and said, okay, as soon as they're done with the game, run your EAS. Okay. That's the only exception I've ever heard on the randomly run EAS. So the broadcast channels can run their EAS tests individually during the commercial breaks. However, cable has a sneaky little trick where they just slam it in, whenever they want to. And this is quite annoying to the broadcasters because it interrupts their program day. And the broadcasters are already required to run an EAS, and now all of a sudden the cable company just slams into their program with an EAS. So this is a big complaint broadcasters have, and a legitimate complaint the broadcasters have with the cable networks. But the cable networks are required to do the EAS just like the television stations are, so they have to cover their butt, and that's the way they do it, is they just slam it in at their convenience. There is an argument that the broadcast channels, if the EAS covers an ad that they've been paid for, then they're supposed to get make good space at some point during the day. Now, there's a whole other question mark on this as being political ads, and that's a whole nother issue to get into, because political ads, if you're running one for a Republican, you have to give equal access to a Democrat, but if they run an EAS test over one of them, you just screwed up the whole system. So make goods are very crucial. Amber alerts are a new thing, and they are simply child abduction notices that crawl across the bottom of your screen. If you see this card, please call us. The live 3-second rule. Supposedly, if you're doing a live broadcast on national broadcast on broadcast channels, you're supposed to have a 3-second delay. And the idea here is if something tragic happens, you can hit the button and kill the signal. For example, the Super Bowl, Janet Jackson has a wardrobe malfunction. If the Super Bowl had followed the rules, they would have had a 3-second delay on that, and they could have pushed the button and killed the signal when Janet Jackson's wardrobe malfunction happened. However, people have gotten lazy about the 3-second rule, and it's come back to bite them a few times now. There's been more than a few instances where it happens. With broadcast news, they don't really bother with a 3-second delay. They just assume it's a little awkward to try and incorporate the 3-second delay in their live broadcast. So they just assume it's easier to risk it and pay the fine than it is to try and build that 3-second delay. The 3-second delay is complicated when you're trying to run commercials and stay in sync with everything. It's just easier to ignore it. So a lot of the local television stations do not offer a 3-second delay, and instead they just run the risk of paying a fine to the FCC. Now, the 3-second rule was originally started because in 1972, Johnny Carson had a streaker run through the background of his show. And they said, that's enough. We're not going to risk that again. We're putting a 3-second delay on you guys. So that way, if the streaker did run through, somebody should be in the control room with his finger on the button. He can kill the signal so it doesn't go out on the air. However, Johnny Carson wound up moving to Burbank and pre-taping his show, so that solved that whole problem. But that's where the 3-second rule came from. More FCC rules. Every station is required to put 90 minutes of PSAs on each week. These are, I have examples there: Woodsy Owl, Smokey the Bear, Truth, No Cigarettes Campaign. Those are all rules by the FCC. They have to put 90 minutes of those on every week. Closed captioning is a new requirement that started about 10 years ago. Every television on broadcast television must now have closed captioning included. Channel allocation, I already mentioned that. You got the channel 1 was for the US, channels 2 through 13 were the VHF, and 13 plus were the UHF. So stations WK, X, and C. Stations in the US broadcasting east of the Mississippi River are start with the letter W. WKRP in Cincinnati, W. Stations broadcasting west of the Mississippi River start with a K. What do we got? King TV, Como TV here in Seattle. Stations with the letter X broadcast from Mexico. So when ZZ Top sings, I heard it on the X, they're talking about they heard it on Spanish radio. And stations with the C are from Canada. So whenever we watch the Winter Olympics here, we watch it on the Canadian channel. That's how that breaks. So CBC, Canada Broadcasting Corporation. There's a thing called border blasting that is, it's particularly with states, but if you're on a border, you can blast your signal into the other territory. And we don't have much control with the X and Cs. If Mexico's going to broadcast across our border, we can't really stop them. Same with Canada. If Canada's going to broadcast across our border, we can't really stop them. However, with the state affiliates, there was actually a legal court hearing on this because I don't remember the specifics of the case, but I believe it was a car dealer in Oklahoma was broadcasting to Texas, and he said, come to Oklahoma to buy your car because you can save on taxes. And the FCC, the federal government, looked at this and said, no, you can't do that. If there's an advantage to going to another state, you can't promote it on a border blast. So, for example, here in Washington, we have a sales tax. Oregon does not. However, Oregon television stations cannot broadcast to Washington and say, come to Oregon and buy your stuff because there's no tax. They're not allowed to do that. That's called border blasting. So you have to think about where your signal is carrying to, and if it crosses a state border, you have to be aware of what the other state's rules are so that you don't get in trouble for border blasting. TV ratings, about 20 years ago, they came up with a rating system. This is PG, EI, TV PG, I can't remember, but they all show up with a little black square on the corner of the broadcast signal that says what it is, and they actually talk to your TV. They talk to a V chip that's built into the TVs now, and you can, with your remote, go into your TV and program what it is you don't want to see on your TV. My pet peeve with the V chip, I played with it one time on my TV, and my pet peeve with it is it goes from the the firmest, most solid, horrible to the least offensive programming. And I was thinking, just for funsies, I was going to try and block off all the stuff that was G rated, and it won't let you do that. You have to go from the most severe, horrible stuff backwards. There was a rule that said you can't own more than 3 media outlets in one city. So if you owned a radio station, a newspaper, and a TV station, that was it. You weren't allowed to own anymore. They have been loosening up that rule in the last 10, 15 years, but every state, every city that has somebody, some kind of a somebody who owns more than 3 media outlets, they had to go and get a waiver from the FCC and say it was okay. The idea here was they didn't want anybody monopolizing the airwaves. They wanted to make sure that separate owners had their ideas expressed. Political ads. The ads have to state who's paying for it. There are limits on private investments. Super PACs are another issue. Stations, it's it's the it's the individual station's job to verify the veracity of the ad. So they have to give fair and balanced. If you're going to run an ad for a Republican candidate, you have to run an ad for a Democratic candidate, and for that matter, you have to run an ad for the independents too. But in most cases, the independents don't have the war chest that the Republicans and Democrats do, so the independents don't get it fair airplay just because they can't afford it. But the stations, they have to offer them the commercial time at the cheapest price available. So political candidates get commercial time at the cheapest price available in that time slot, and whatever price the Republican pays is the same price the Democrat has to pay, and the independent has to pay the same price. And you have to provide equal airtime. So if you're going to run an ad for a Republican, you have to run an ad for a Democrat and the comparable time slot with the comparable audience share, etc. Um, it is the station's job to verify the veracity of an ad. If the station looks at an ad and says, "We think you're lying," it's it's the station's job to go back to the people who produce the ad and say, "Show us the facts that back the statement up." And if they're satisfied that the producers can produce the corroborating evidence to verify what they've just said on the commercial, then those facts get tucked into their book. That weekly book you can go and see at the TV station. They put it in the book to say, this is what they said, this is the proof that it's accurate. If the producers of the ad cannot verify the veracity, then they have to either give them another ad or forfeit their time or forfeit their comparable time. So, and in fact, that does happen with rival Republican and Democrats. They go back and forth and say that ad wasn't legit. You can't show that one. So, super PACs. There's a lot about super PACs. You can contribute anonymously to super PACs, and you can contribute unlimited amounts. And there's not supposed to be any affiliation between a candidate and who they're endorsing. Now, super PACs are a whole separate thing, and it's kind of a new thing, and I'm not going to go there right now. PBS. Oh, geez. I'm going to skip ahead on PBS.